Did you know that tomatoes are the second most widely consumed vegetable after potatoes? In 2011, Canadians consumed approximately 8.19 kilograms of fresh tomatoes per person. In the same year, Canadian growers produced 268,502,255 kilograms of greenhouse tomatoes. Its farm gate value was a whopping $496 million. Today, we are going to focus on the greenhouse tomato industry in Canada and take a look at how your tomatoes get from seed to store. Our examples are from a medium-sized tomato greenhouse called Enns Plant Farm, located in the country's tomato capital, Leamington, Ontario. Do you know where your tomatoes come from? Tomatoes are grown in open fields or in protected environments such as a greenhouse. Canada is the largest producer of greenhouse tomatoes in North America, and Leamington has the largest concentration of tomato greenhouses. At approximately 355 hectares, this area is larger than the entire corresponding American industry. Greenhouse tomatoes were a specialty product in the early 1990s, with most production imported from the Netherlands. However, during the mid-1990s, the Canadian tomato greenhouse industry expanded greatly. Greenhouse tomato production grew from roughly 60 million pounds in 1990 to 544 million pounds in 2010. Instead of operating as a separate niche industry, the greenhouse tomato industry has become integrated into the fresh tomato market, transforming into a conventional commodity. Now, the greenhouse industry is large enough to impact industry dynamics for all fresh tomato growers. In other words, producers have some market power. There is also free entry and exit into the market. No knowledge, training, or certification is required to become a tomato producer. In Ontario, all growers need to register or belong to the Ontario Greenhouse Vegetable Producers Marketing Board, which does not regulate production or restrict entry. The board simply requires producers to pay a fee that's calculated based on the area in production. The expansion of greenhouse tomato production has also led to the differentiation of the fresh tomato market. Variation is based on shape, size, degree of ripeness, color, and variety. Varieties that farmers grow include beefsteak, cocktail, grape, cherry, Roma, heirloom, and tomato on the vine, or TOVs. TOVs are only grown in greenhouses, which gives greenhouse producers a very competitive edge. In recent years, TOVs have become the dominant greenhouse tomatoes. Growers are now offering different sizes and shapes of TOVs, including the traditional TOV, cherry, and Campari. As such, greenhouse tomatoes are not homogeneous. They are very similar and they are substitutable, but they are not the same. As such, the market structure of the greenhouse tomato industry may be characterized as a monopolistic competition. So just how competitive is the greenhouse tomato market? Competition for the North American market is increasing. For Canadian growers, the USA and Canada are target markets. At EPF, for example, 80% of production goes to the US market, and the remaining 20% is sold locally. While there has been limited European competition for these markets due to the high transportation costs associated with supplying the produce, this market is being saturated by greenhouse products from Mexico and parts of Central America and the Caribbean. Canadian growers must compete with the southern producers, who are more advantaged with respect to weather conditions, the cost of labor, and regulatory requirements. In terms of retail markets, greenhouse-grown tomatoes only end up in the fresh market, while tomatoes grown in fields are destined either for fresh consumption or for processing. Greenhouse tomatoes are mainly sold through supermarkets. Small and medium-sized growers use intermediaries called marketers to sell their products to large grocery stores such as Costco, Loblaws, and Walmart. Growers also use alternative local and regional market outlets such as farmers markets, farm and roadside stands, and specialty shops. Greenhouse tomatoes have a limited market access through the food service channel, such as restaurants, schools, and hospitals. This is because field-grown mature green tomatoes are preferred in this channel for their firmness and long shelf life.
The price of greenhouse tomatoes fluctuates during the year as producers must compete with field-grown and imported tomatoes. Greenhouse tomatoes generally have higher retail prices than field tomatoes. As the greenhouse industry of the US and Canada expanded over the last few years, prices have declined despite increasing demand. There is a lack of government regulation with respect to the pricing of greenhouse tomatoes. While the Ontario Greenhouse Vegetable Growers, aka the Commodity Board, may set a weekly price minimum, in practice it does not. In reality, the price is determined through negotiations between the marketer, which is Mastron in this case, and the grocery stores to whom it sells the produce to. The marketing of greenhouse tomatoes in Canada is regulated under the Canada Agricultural Products Act, which outlines national standards and grades for greenhouse tomatoes. However, it does not regulate price. As a marketer, Mastron's operations are characteristic of a monopoly, in the sense that they control the marketing and distribution schedule in the heart of the Canadian greenhouse tomato industry. Producers are price takers in the sense that they have no knowledge of the market price that their product is going to be sold for. Instead, they are compensated based upon the volume of tomatoes they provide to the marketer. Production is at its peak in the summer season. Supply is limited in the winter season and prices are relatively high. To meet the market demand for greenhouse tomatoes during the winter, some greenhouse tomato distributors established agreements with American and Mexican plants to supplement low supplies. When the supply is lower, the cost is higher. When the supply is greater, the cost is lower. The price elasticity of supply would be considered to be inelastic in most cases, which means supply is not that sensitive to price changes. Now, moving forward to demand. The demand for greenhouse vegetable products is growing. The U.S. greenhouse tomato market is increasing dramatically as many consumers will now pay an increased price for a red, ripe tomato. If there is a change occurring in demand, it is caused by one or more of the non-price determinants of demand. The demand is affected by field of production and the season. For example, when California has a good year, the demand for Canadian product decreases. In the winter, when the field cannot grow, demand for greenhouse products is high. In contrast, in the summer, all producers, whether that be field and greenhouse, can grow, so the demand of greenhouse products is lower. That then affects price. Moreover, the law of demand occurs in all markets, specifically for two main reasons: the substitution effect, which accounts for consumers favoring cheaper commodities, and the real income effect, which accounts for the change in consumers' purchasing power. Now, let's look at non-price determinant impacts on demand. Studies showing health benefits of tomatoes are one of the key factors. Tomatoes have been promoted as sources of different vitamins and antioxidants in recent years. Another one is healthy eating trends. An increase in the consumption of healthy foods and the popularity of a variety of salads, salad bars, and vegetable and salad stuffed sandwiches has contributed to this upward trend. This trend is also accompanied by the growing ethnic population, with preference to vegetable diets. This trend, paired with the introduction of new and improved tomato varieties, has led to a surge in the fresh tomato market. This ultimately serves as a prime example of a non-price determinant impact on demand. Now looking at elasticity. The price elasticity, which essentially is the measure of price responsiveness to the quantity demanded of demand, is said to be inelastic for greenhouse tomatoes. Now on to consumer preferences. Quality, variety, size, and package type are the criteria when consumers are selecting a particular tomato. Consumers report that they will sort to find qualities such as looking for fruit that is firm, blemish-free, and consistent in color, and will postpone purchase due to poor quality. Consumers will also pay a premium for quality and pesticide-free fruit. Freshness is understood to mean quality. Red stem tomatoes will sell at a higher price simply because the tomatoes are attached to the stem, implying freshness. Are there substitutes for greenhouse tomatoes? There are varied stances on the substitutability of field and greenhouse tomatoes. In a study conducted by the United States Department of Agriculture, 3 out of 5 responding field growers consider them substitutes. However, only 3 out of the 11 greenhouse growers agree. What about canned tomatoes? In the United States, Heinz and Campbell's in the early 20th century started producing processed and canned foods, particularly soups and sauces, as a substitute for fresh tomatoes. But are the canned tomatoes truly a substitute for fresh greenhouse tomatoes? The answer depends on the consumer's tastes, preferences, budget, and uses.
Now let's take a look at some factors and costs of production. In comparison to field tomatoes, greenhouse tomatoes have a higher per unit cost of production. Producing greenhouse tomatoes requires a great deal of land, capital, and labor. Those interested in entering the industry must first purchase the land and build the infrastructure in order to protect crops and to control settings within the greenhouse, such as heating, irrigation, humidity, carbon dioxide, and fertilizer. In the tomato greenhouse industry, the short-run cost of production is greater than the long-run costs, given the large initial spending that is necessary to construct the infrastructure. In addition to constructing infrastructure, greenhouse owners also incur mortgage payments, which is a sunk cost. Moreover, the necessary equipment used by workers, such as scissor cars, lift trucks, and transportation trucks, constitutes a fixed cost in the short run. And the two greatest variable costs are labor and fuel for heating the greenhouse. The cost of labor is determined by the provincial minimum wage and the number of employees each greenhouse employs. At Enns Plant Farm, during the peak season, there are approximately 70 employees, and during low seasons, in the winter, the farm employs roughly 40 people. Other operating costs include electricity for lighting and airflow fans. Growers must also purchase plant materials such as seeds and seedlings, as well as biological means for pest control and bumblebees for plant pollination. There are also other miscellaneous crop expenses, such as that for fertilizer and clips in order to support the plants. To give you a better understanding of the dynamics of cost, average total production for tomato greenhouses in 2011 totaled $816,632,000. On average, labor accounted for about 30% of total production costs. This was followed by marketing costs at 17% and natural gas costs at 13%. Crop expenses account for less than 10% of total production. But more importantly, what about profits? In the short run, net profit for a medium-sized greenhouse such as Enns Plant Farm ranges between $500,000 to $1 million after mortgage payments. The economic returns in the greenhouse vegetable industry have only provided a modest return to equity capital and the labor contributed by producers. Thus, many greenhouses tend to be family-owned businesses rather than corporate businesses, which require higher levels of returns on capital and management. The greenhouse tomato industry serves as a unique case. There is essentially no surplus. In 2014, Enns Plant Farm yielded a total yearly production of 36 kilos per square meter. All tomatoes that met the number 1 grade tomato standards are taken by the marketer. Any remaining tomatoes are sold as number 2 grade tomatoes for a lower price to the marketer or at roadside vegetable stands and to local vendors who then sell to grocery stores. However, in the event of a loss, the producer bears the costs, while the marketer continues to take its share of profits. Although the greenhouse tomato industry can be profitable, it is highly volatile and unpredictable. A few of the challenges that producers face include currency exchange rate swings, rising energy and labor costs, and high operating expenses per hectare. In recent years, low market prices and a lack of available labor have affected profitability in the greenhouse tomato industry, resulting in the employment of migrant workers at most greenhouses. Since the greenhouse industry is heavily reliant upon the U.S. markets, it can be impacted by the value of the Canadian dollar relative to the U.S. dollar. For example, a weaker Canadian dollar can make the U.S. market more lucrative for producers, as the falling dollar results in rising greenhouse vegetable revenues.
To conclude, here's some food for thought. Overall, this industry has flourished in terms of production, and greenhouses in Canada are characterized as profitable ventures. However, it's important to keep in mind that this market is still relatively new, and with rapid expansion of greenhouses in Mexico, the profitability of greenhouse industry for Canadian producers is uncertain. In addition, as the industry continues to expand in Canada, policymakers may want to take issue with the lack of government regulation with respect to pricing of greenhouse tomatoes. As it stands, marketers are free to engage in questionable practices and set prices to their benefit. The implementation of price regulations may help to enhance transparency for both producers and ensure that producers are compensated fairly for their goods. From this perspective, price regulations could provide producers an incentive to enter the market and thus serve as a catalyst for industry growth.